My girlfriend, Julia, looked me dead in the eye and said, "My friends think you limit me, so we're done." And I just stared at her for maybe 3 seconds before I replied, "Cool, then go join them." And the silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife because our entire friend group was sitting right there at the table watching this unfold like it was some kind of reality TV finale they'd been waiting for. The way their faces changed from smug confidence to complete shock told me everything I needed to know about who had really been running our relationship for the past 6 months. I'm a cybersecurity analyst, which means I spend my days looking at patterns, identifying threats, and solving problems with logic instead of emotion. And that's exactly what got me labeled as emotionally unavailable by people who had never actually bothered to know me. I'm the guy who shows up on time, remembers important dates, asks how your day went, and actually listens to the answer. But apparently, that's not enough when you're being measured against some podcast host checklist of what a boyfriend should be. Julia and I met 2 years ago at a coffee shop where she was reading a book about minimalism and I was working on a security audit for a client. And we started talking about how most people overcomplicate their lives when simple solutions work better. She was studying graphic design, had this calm energy about her, and we'd spend hours just walking around the city talking about everything from architecture to weather patterns. And it felt real in a way that didn't need Instagram stories or constant validation from strangers. Our first year together was genuinely good because we communicated like adults. We had our own lives, but made time for each other. And when problems came up, we talked them through instead of letting them fester. She moved into my apartment after about 8 months, and it was smooth. We split chores based on who was better at what. We cooked together on weekends, and we had this running joke about how boring we must seem to other people because we'd rather stay in and watch documentaries than go clubbing. Then she got the job at Thrive Unfiltered Podcast as a production assistant. And everything started shifting in ways I didn't recognize at first. It started with small things like new phrases showing up in her vocabulary, words like toxic patterns and emotional labor, and that doesn't serve me, used in context that didn't quite fit our actual situation. I remember the first time she came home and told me we needed to have a conversation about boundaries, and I said, "Okay, what's wrong?" And she pulled out her phone and started reading from notes she'd taken during a podcast recording about relationship red flags. I listened to the whole thing and then asked her which of those red flags she'd actually seen in our relationship, and she got quiet and said she was just trying to be proactive. Looking back, that should have been my first real warning sign, but I figured she was just excited about the job and trying to apply what she was learning. The podcast itself was run by this woman named Miranda, who had built an entire brand around helping women identify manipulation and stand up for themselves, which sounds great on paper until you realize the show's formula was basically taking normal relationship friction and repackaging it as abuse. Every episode followed the same pattern where they'd read anonymous submissions, analyze them through the most uncharitable lens possible, and then celebrate women who left their partners over things like, "He wanted to discuss the budget before buying a new car," or "He asked me to text when I got home safe." Their audience ate it up because the show made them feel empowered for seeing red flags everywhere. And the comment section was always full of people sharing their own stories about how they'd finally left their boyfriend who committed crimes like being tired after work or having opinions about dinner plans. Julia started inviting me to the live recordings, which happened twice a month at this venue downtown. And I went because I wanted to support her career, even though the whole vibe made me uncomfortable. The first time I showed up, the entire production team gave me this look like they were studying a specimen. And during the break, Miranda came over and introduced herself and immediately asked what I did for work. I told her cybersecurity, and she got this smile and said, "Oh, so you're analytical. That must be challenging for Julia." Like being good at my job was somehow a personality defect. I just nodded and said, "We make it work." And she patted my arm and walked away. And Julia told me later that Miranda thought I seemed guarded, which was apparently code for emotionally unavailable. After that recording, we were walking to the car, and Julia said, "They think you're emotionally unavailable." And I asked her what she thought, and she hesitated just long enough that I knew she'd been discussing me with them. She eventually said no. She didn't think that, but she could see where they were coming from because I didn't always express my feelings in obvious ways. And I reminded her that I'd literally spent 4 hours the previous week helping her redesign her portfolio website and listening to her stress about a difficult client. But apparently, that didn't count as emotional availability in their framework. The dynamic started changing fast after that because suddenly every normal interaction we had was being filtered through this lens of whether it constituted a red flag or healthy behavior. I'd suggest we stay in on Friday because I had an early morning security patch to deploy and she'd accuse me of isolating her from friends. I'd ask if she wanted to talk about why she seemed stressed and she'd say I was demanding emotional labor. I planned a weekend trip because we both loved hiking and she'd question whether I was trying to control her schedule. Nothing I did was ever just a normal thing a person does anymore. It was all evidence of some deeper pattern that needed to be examined and discussed with her friends who had never even had a real conversation with me. The really crazy part was watching her adopt their speaking style. Like she'd come home and use these perfectly constructed therapy speak sentences that sounded nothing like how she used to talk. She'd say things like, "I'm noticing a pattern where you center your own comfort over my needs." When I asked if we could turn down the TV, because I was on a work call, and I just stared at her wondering where my girlfriend went and who this person was reading from a script. I tried talking to her about it multiple times, asked if she felt like she was losing herself a bit in this new job. And she'd immediately get defensive and say I was threatened by her growth, like she'd been some incomplete person before and only now was becoming her true self by analyzing our relationship to death with people who decided I was the villain before ever meeting me. The production team started showing up more in our lives, too. Like, we'd be at a bar, and suddenly Miranda and 2 other women from the podcast would appear, and Julia would light up, and I'd become invisible. They'd talk about recent episodes and share stories about their own relationships. And every single story ended with them realizing their boyfriend was manipulative and leaving. And they'd all congratulate each other like escaping was the only acceptable outcome for any relationship that required actual work. I'd sit there nursing a beer and watching Julia laugh at their jokes and nod along to their theories. And I could feel her slipping away into this world where I'd already been convicted of crimes I didn't commit. One night, about 4 months into her job at the podcast, we were supposed to have dinner together, just us, something we hadn't done in weeks because she was always either working late or meeting up with the production team. I made reservations at this Italian place she loved and got home early to change. And when she walked in, she immediately said, "Miranda and the team want to grab drinks tonight. Is it cool if we reschedule?" And I just looked at her and said, we'd had these plans for 2 weeks. And she got this expression like I'd asked her to choose between me and her friends. She said, "See, this is what they mean. You make me feel guilty for having a social life." And I told her that wanting to have one dinner together after barely seeing each other wasn't making her feel guilty. It was just basic relationship maintenance. But she was already texting them that she'd be there. I ended up going to the restaurant alone, sat at the table with 2 menus, and ate in silence while the waiter tried very hard to pretend this wasn't depressing. That was the night I realized I wasn't dating Julia anymore. I was dating the podcast version of who they thought she should be. And that person had already decided I was the problem. I still didn't know the worst part yet, though. Didn't know that our private conversations and my text messages and even my work schedule had become content for their group chat. Raw material they were analyzing like I was some kind of case study in manipulation tactics. I didn't know that every word I said to her in private was being screenshotted and dissected by people who'd never spoken to me beyond surface-level small talk at recordings. And I definitely didn't know that they were cataloging everything into categories like isolation attempts and guilt tripping and financial control. All I knew was that the woman I loved was disappearing and being replaced by someone who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a partner to build a life with. And I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The moment I discovered they'd been reading my private messages was so surreal that my brain almost refused to process it at first. Like when you see something so wrong that your mind needs a few seconds to catch up to what your eyes are showing you. It was a Tuesday night, and Julia was in the shower. Her iPad was on the coffee table, buzzing with notifications. And normally I wouldn't even glance at her devices because privacy was something I actually believed in, unlike apparently everyone else in her life. But the notification preview was right there on the lock screen, and it said, Miranda, clip 3 is perfect classic isolation phrase. And my stomach just dropped because I knew exactly what clip 3 was. It was a voice memo I'd sent Julia 4 days earlier about wanting to book a cabin for our anniversary. I picked up the iPad, and it unlocked when I angled it. And what I saw made me feel physically sick, because I was looking at a group chat called Julia's Circle of Trust with 12 members, including all the podcast production team. I started scrolling up, and my hand was shaking because months of our private conversations were just sitting there. Screenshot after screenshot of text messages I'd sent her, photos of us together with annotations pointing out my body language, and voice memos I'd recorded when I was too tired to type. All of it dissected and analyzed like I was some kind of criminal suspect. There was the text where I'd said I was working late on a security breach and couldn't make dinner. And under it, Miranda had written, "Notice the vague terminology, classic avoidance of real intimacy." There was the message where I'd suggested we save money for a down payment instead of taking an expensive vacation, labeled as financial manipulation, controlling the narrative around their future. There was even a photo from a Saturday morning where I was making breakfast. And apparently, my expression was dismissive because I wasn't smiling enough. Never mind that I'd literally just woken up and hadn't had coffee yet. Every single normal interaction we'd had for months had been fed into this machine that converted regular relationship moments into evidence of toxicity. And what made it worse was seeing Julia's responses in the chat where she'd add context, but always in a way that made me look worse. She'd write things like, "He says he's tired, but I think he just doesn't want to engage emotionally." Or, "He planned this whole trip without asking what I wanted," when the reality was I'd literally sent her 3 different cabin options and asked her to pick her favorite. The chat went back 6 months, almost to the exact week she'd started working at the podcast, and I could track the change in her language in real time as she went from defending me to questioning everything I did to eventually just accepting their interpretation of my actions without pushback. There was this one exchange where I texted her during a work meeting saying I missed her and wished I was home. Just a sweet, normal message. And someone named Chloe had responded in the group chat, "Love bombing after a period of emotional distance, textbook cycle." And Julia had replied with a thinking emoji instead of telling them they were insane. I sat there on the couch reading through months of my life being turned into content for people who seemed to genuinely believe that any man who wasn't performing happiness every second was secretly abusive. And the worst part was I couldn't even be angry because anger would just prove their point. I heard the shower turn off, and I knew I had maybe 2 minutes before Julia came out. So I took screenshots of everything, sent them to myself, deleted the sent messages from her iPad, and put it back exactly where it was. My hands were still shaking when she walked into the living room in her bathrobe asking what I wanted for dinner, and I just looked at her and said we needed to talk about privacy and boundaries. And I watched her face change into this defensive expression before I'd even explained what I meant. She immediately asked if I'd gone through her phone, and I told her no. I saw a notification on her iPad that made me concerned, and she grabbed it off the table like I'd threatened to smash it. I asked her directly if she'd been sharing our private conversations with the podcast team, and she got very still, and that stillness told me everything before she even opened her mouth. She said, "They're helping me see patterns I couldn't see on my own." And I asked her what patterns exactly, and she started listing things in this rehearsed way that sounded nothing like her actual voice. She said I had a habit of making plans without consulting her, that I used work as an excuse to avoid emotional conversations, that I made her feel guilty for spending time with friends, and every single point was something straight out of a podcast episode I'd heard them record. I asked her for specific examples with dates and context, and she couldn't give me any, just kept talking in these broad generalizations about patterns and red flags and things that felt manipulative, even if she couldn't explain why. I told her that sharing my text messages and voice memos with a dozen strangers without my consent was an actual violation of privacy. Not just a feeling, but a real thing that actually happened. And she said, "Miranda says your wording is manipulative." Like that was a response. I just stared at her because in that moment, I realized I wasn't talking to my girlfriend anymore. I was talking to a committee. Every word I said was going to be reported back and analyzed and used as evidence in a case I didn't even know I was on trial for. She kept going, told me the group chat was a safe space for her to process her feelings that I couldn't understand because I'd never been gaslit the way she had in past relationships. And I wanted to point out that I'd been there for every story about her difficult ex and had never once shared those private moments with anyone. But there was no point because she'd already decided that my expectation of basic privacy was just another form of control, another red flag, another reason they were right about me all along. I asked her if she understood that everything I told her in confidence, every vulnerable moment, every private thought was now entertainment for people who didn't know me and had already decided I was the villain. And she said, "They're not strangers. They're my support system." I told her a support system doesn't require screenshots and forensic analysis of text messages. It requires actual conversation and trust. And she looked at me with this expression that was pure podcast rhetoric and said, "You're just upset because you can't control the narrative anymore." The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes, her speaking in borrowed phrases and me trying to explain that privacy isn't control until finally I just stopped talking because I realized nothing I said would matter. She'd been marinating in this environment where every man was suspect and every boundary was oppression for so long that she couldn't see how completely insane it was to treat your partner like a research subject. I went to bed that night in the spare room because I couldn't stand to be near her. And I lay there in the dark thinking about how every word I'd said that evening was probably already typed up in that group chat with commentary about my defensive behavior and inability to take accountability. I thought about all the times I'd comforted her when she was stressed, all the little things I did to make her life easier, all the ways I'd shown up consistently and reliably, and how none of that mattered because it wasn't performative enough for an audience that needed me to be a villain. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. And around noon, I got a text that just said, "We need to talk." 7 p.m. at the Grove Bar. And I knew exactly what was coming because you don't schedule a breakup conversation at a public place unless you want witnesses or you're afraid of the other person's reaction. I texted back sure and spent the rest of the day working from home, finishing up a security audit and making sure my professional life was solid because I knew my personal life was about to implode and I wanted at least one area of stability. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt, really. I was just exhausted from months of being treated like a suspect in my own relationship. And honestly, part of me felt relieved that it was finally going to be over. I showed up at the Grove at 6:55 because being late would obviously be another red flag. And Julia was already there at a corner table with 3 of her podcast friends sitting at the bar pretending they weren't watching. And I realized this wasn't going to be a conversation at all. It was going to be a performance with an audience ready to validate whatever she said. I sat down across from Julia at that corner table and immediately noticed she had note cards in front of her, actual physical note cards like she was about to give a presentation. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to be a real conversation. She started talking before I even ordered a drink, using that same therapy speak voice that had replaced her actual personality, telling me she'd been doing a lot of reflection and realized our relationship had become unhealthy for her growth. I just listened and watched her glance down at the cards every few seconds. And when she paused, I asked her to give me one specific example of something unhealthy I'd done, just one concrete moment with context, and she fumbled through her cards looking increasingly frustrated. She said things felt wrong and the dynamic was off, and she'd been walking on eggshells. But when I asked when specifically she'd felt that way, she couldn't answer, just kept circling back to feelings and patterns and things Miranda had helped her identify. I could see her friends at the bar leaning and trying to hear, and I realized they'd probably helped write those note cards, probably spent hours crafting the script for her to follow. She eventually just said what she probably planned to say from the start, the line about her friends thinking I limited her, and I felt this weird calm wash over me because finally we were getting to the truth. I asked her if her friends' opinions mattered more than her own experience of our relationship, and she said they could see things she couldn't. And that's when I knew there was no relationship left to save. I told her, "Cool, then go join them." And the look on her face was pure shock, like she'd expected me to beg or argue or give her the dramatic scene they'd probably predicted I'd make. Her friends at the bar had gone completely silent, and I could feel them staring. And Julia just sat there opening and closing her mouth, trying to figure out what to say now that her script hadn't accounted for me, just agreeing. I pulled out my wallet, put down $40 for the drinks neither of us had touched, and told her I hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for. Then I stood up, walked past her friends without even glancing at them, and left the bar feeling lighter than I had in months because the performance was finally over. The next few days were mechanical and efficient because that's how I handle problems. I make a plan and execute it. I packed up all her stuff from my apartment, every piece of clothing and every book and every random item she'd left scattered around over 2 years. And I boxed it all neatly and left it in the building lobby with a text telling her when she could pick it up. I blocked her number, blocked her on every social media platform, blocked her friends, blocked anyone associated with that podcast, and I did it all without anger or drama because I was just done giving them content to analyze. She tried calling from different numbers, and I never answered. She sent emails that I deleted without reading. And 3 days after the bar, she showed up at my apartment building, but I'd already told the front desk not to let her up. Security called me, and I could hear her in the background saying, "I just want to talk." And I told them to inform her that all her belongings were already collected and we had nothing to discuss. My coworker asked me a week later why I seemed so much more relaxed, and I realized it was because I wasn't being monitored anymore, wasn't second-guessing every word I said or every decision I made, wasn't living in a relationship that had turned into a surveillance state. I started going to the gym again, reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting, picked up a project car I'd been wanting to work on, and just generally remembered what it felt like to exist without someone documenting my every move for an audience of critics. About 2 months after the breakup, my friend sent me a link to a podcast episode titled When You're the Red Flag, and I knew immediately it was about me, even though they didn't use my name. I listened to the whole thing, and it was surreal hearing Julia describe our relationship as this oppressive situation where I'd controlled her schedule and isolated her from friends and made her question her own reality, none of which had actually happened. They painted me as this master manipulator who'd been so subtle about my tactics that even I didn't know I was doing it. And the comments section was full of people praising Julia for escaping and calling me every name you can imagine. The thing that bothered me wasn't the lies exactly. It was how many people believed them without question. How ready everyone was to accept that any relationship that ended must have been toxic. And any man who seemed calm must have been hiding something sinister. But here's what they didn't expect. The episode blew up way bigger than their usual content. And suddenly people who actually knew me started recognizing the story. My company's HR actually reached out after someone sent them the episode asking if they were aware their employee was being accused of manipulation on a podcast. And I had to explain the whole situation with screenshots of that group chat I'd saved. Former coworkers, mutual friends, even Julia's own cousin reached out privately to say they knew the podcast version didn't match reality. And slowly, this counter-narrative started building in the comments where people pointed out that every example she gave was either completely normal behavior or didn't actually show what she claimed it showed. The podcast reputation started taking hits because people went back through old episodes and realized almost every story followed the same pattern of turning regular relationship dynamics into manipulation narratives, and advertisers started quietly pulling out. I didn't participate in any of it, didn't defend myself publicly or add fuel to the fire. Just let the truth speak for itself while I focused on actually living my life. 6 months after everything imploded, I got an email from Julia. No subject line, just a message that said, "You weren't toxic. I'm sorry I let them convince me you were." And I stared at it for a long time before closing it without responding, because what was there to say? Sorry doesn't undo months of violation and betrayal. Doesn't erase the fact that she chose strangers' opinions over her own experience. Doesn't change that she was willing to destroy me to fit into a community that required everyone to have a villain origin story. I'm dating someone new now, a software engineer I met through friends who thinks the whole podcast cult thing is insane and who actually communicates like a real person instead of reading from script. We have normal disagreements where we talk through problems instead of cataloging them as evidence. And when she tells her friends about me, it's because she wants to share her life, not because she needs them to validate her reality. I learned that when someone turns you into a character in their narrative instead of treating you like a real person, the only move is to walk off their stage and let them perform for an empty room. The podcast eventually got canceled after multiple sponsors dropped them, and Miranda posted some non-apology about learning and growing. And I heard through mutual friends that Julia left the production company and moved to a different city for a fresh start. I don't hate her, and I don't spend time thinking about revenge, because honestly, she gave me the greatest gift, which was showing me exactly who not to waste my time on. And now I'm just focused on building a life with someone who sees partnership as collaboration instead of content creation.